Let's get started making the world's largest Lazy Susan. So we're starting out this project with some fence pickets, and this is exactly how the Lazy Susan's going to look. I didn't say it was going to be the prettiest, I just said it was going to be the world's largest. Well, in fact, actually, I'm just using this as a frame of reference to figure out my circle, mostly because I realized I didn't have enough material to make a square, and I needed to know exactly how long I could rough cut these to preserve and not have to make another trip back to the lumberyard. Speaking of preserving, you saw that bow in that board, it was about 1/8 of an inch. So I'm going to cut it in half, and what that's going to do is it's going to get rid of a lot of that bow and save me some material, because I want this as thick as possible, because this will be a completely flat panel with very little support other than the lazy hardware. So by doing this and cutting each board to rough size, I'm able to mill everything down to the close to final dimension and keep it as thick as possible. And you just saw me rubbing my wood, and that wasn't just for pleasure, it was also to check for grain direction. One way the board will feel prickly, and the other way it's nice and smooth. The smooth way is with the grain, which is the direction that you want to plane with so you don't get tear out. And if you found that tip helpful and you want more like it, then check out my planer sled video or my jointing without a jointer video below in the description. With the beech all milled up, I'm going to start the glue up, and I'm going to do this in phases because it's much easier to wrangle 3 boards together and get them all nice and coplanar and flat on the top than it is to try to do 9 all at once. So I'm going to do 3 in 3 different sections, and then I'm going to put those 3 sections together. So each time I essentially have 3 boards I need to align and get flattened, and I do that with a combination of a hammer and just squeezing the boards into alignment and then clamping them down. So no alignment aids, no dominoes, no biscuits in between these boards. It's all just by feel because they were slightly different. I had one board that was a slightly different thickness, and I want to keep the top flat, and I'll show you how I fix that later. Contrary to popular belief, you do not need perfectly straight boards for panel glue ups. In fact, I'm intentionally cutting a bow in this board to create a spring joint. Spring joints apply tension in the panel, which will help combat unwanted wood movement. And it doesn't take much of a gap, in this case, a 32nd of an inch, but it does have a big impact on the longevity of the piece. And I'll include a link in the description explaining exactly how this works. I was having just a slight problem aligning this portion of the panel, and I realized as I was pushing and pulling on it that all I needed to do was just use my head. When you have stubborn boards that just won't quite line up, a clamp at the end usually works to pull them into position, but in this case, a few inches in, the board was still sitting slightly lower than I wanted it to be, so I used a block of wood under the panel and applied some pressure on the top to pop it into position, and then I can just use some clamps across the entire panel to hold it all into place and keep it nice and flat. And I checked for flatness with a level to make sure I had minimal hand plane work to do to clean it up later. Speaking of hand planes, I'm still going to use one, but this is a smoothing plane, and it's used really just to level everything off and clean up any of the seams in between the panels. And you could do this with a sander, but this is just faster and easier and saves me time sanding, which is always a bonus. I'm usually a do-it-yourself kind of person, hence how I got started in this whole furniture business to begin with. But in this case, I ended up buying a jig from Rockler. And yeah, a circle jig, it's not the most complicated thing to make. I could have done it, but in this case, I wanted an ellipses jig for a future project, and I figured might as well buy it now so I could prioritize project time instead of jig building. And that's always my problem when I build jigs, is generally they're for a single function, single use, and it's not scalable for the future. And this hopefully will be, which is why I bought it, so that I can also cut ellipses or ovals with the same thing. And the first thing I needed to do was get rid of those pesky instructions so I could get myself right to work. After a quick consultation with the actually helpful instruction manual, I found out that I needed to find the center of my workpiece so I could screw this plate down directly in the middle. And this will secure a pin in the center. I did find out that it did not come with any screws, so I dug through the drawer that everybody has full of miscellaneous screws and used some of those to secure this in the middle. Once done, you could put the jig on and attach your router to it and get to cutting. And that's what really sold me on this jig, is the fact that it was really customizable in the size circle that you can make, and I needed to make multiple circles, multiple passes, and you'll see that in a second here. But before I do, I'm going to go ahead and do a little bit of cable management using my garage door opener. Yeah, as I was saying, it gave me the flexibility to not have that cord running around right behind me, and I had to manage it the entire way.
And it was at this moment that I was absolutely stunned with Susan's beauty here, and I knew right there and then that I just had to put a ring on it. Now, if that joke made you chuckle, then you're my type of person, and you need to go down into the comments and leave me your best Lazy Susan joke right now. And if you thought it was horrible and it made you cringe, then go down in the comments and tell me so. I deserve it. At this point, my router decided to stop working for some reason, and I have a video exactly on how to fix this, but the reason why is because the switch here gets full of sawdust and it needs to be cleaned out every once in a while, especially when you use it upside down in a router table. Once fixed, it was back to work for another slight mix-up. Did you see how my router took a little bit of a dive there? Well, this is where I started my cut. It was right here, and took a bit of a dive. Left with the bottom side, so I'll decide if I'm going to patch that, but yeah. Now, this Beach Susan may have a new scar, but she'll be able to hide it under her skirt, so no, I'm not going to fix it. Instead, I'll leave this mistake as a calling card, a maker's mark, if you will. And now it's time to whip out the jigsaw that always drops blades randomly out of it, and I don't know why this godforsaken tool does this. If anyone watching knows why this Ryobi jigsaw won't hold on to blades and you have a fix for the problem, please leave me a comment down below, because I want to know, because it's a very frustrating tool for me to use. But the whole reason why I'm going through this pain here is because I need to trim off the excess so that when I flush trim this later, it's easier on my bit in my router and it leaves a nice cleaner cut so that I can flush everything up to my original cut that I made with the jig. And with the excess trimmed off, I can put the ring underneath it for the first time and see this lazy beach in action. Get it? Because it's a Lazy Susan and I use beech wood, so she's a lazy beach. Earlier, I mentioned a board was slightly thinner than the rest. Well, here it is, and luckily I had aligned the top, so that was flat, but the bottom needed a little bit of fixing, and I didn't want to have to flatten the entire panel, so instead I feathered in the edges using hand tools. And I adjusted the edges because you'll never notice Susan's lumpy bottom as she spins around on your table. And on to the finishing process. I skipped the whole boring sanding piece to bring into my first of 4 parts. My first step is to spray this whole thing with a sealer coat of water-based poly. And that will help seal in the wood and make it easier for the next step, which is actually going to be to paint this. And I know what you're thinking, paint? But that's a nice piece of wood. Why would you paint it? Well, it's because that's what the client wanted. And I'm going to do something a little bit different on this one. So stay tuned and see how it's going to turn out in the end, which I think you're actually really going to enjoy. With that lazy beach Susan in her forever home, it's time for me to fess up. I did not make the Guinness World Record book. I missed it by about 1,772 feet to this big old ice disc up in Maine. Well, I hope you enjoyed that, and don't forget to subscribe down below so that you can tune in to the next one.